he didn't like to give strength or memory to the abuses he faced. Hello, welcome to another week of Mix It Up, Black History and the Restoration. I'm Taylor Ricks, and this is where we mix up a recipe and mix up the restoration by learning about early Black members of the church. And I'm just so happy to see you all here again this week. Thank you for joining me week after week. I'm going to be honest with you. This week was a difficult and emotional one, and I kind of just I wanted to skip it. This is sometimes it's hard to talk about topics like slavery and all of those things, and it just gets difficult and heavy. And honestly, I don't live in a very diverse place, and having been adopted, I don't have people of diversity in my family or around me, and sometimes these weeks just get hard and heavy. Especially as a lot of people around me don't relate, and seeing lives lost for whatever reason, but so many people of color and in minority groups in 1 week is just hard. And so I appreciate you being here, and just I hope for a little grace and a little patience as we talk this week. But I felt it was important to still share a story with you this week. We're gonna do it for Ned. It's dedicated to Ned this week. I feel like his story is important and that we all need to hear it, and so that is why I'm here this week. I'm hoping he'll give me some strength to get through it this week. Ned Leggroan, his birth name is Edward, but he goes by Ed, and I think he has some like either a son or a grandchild that's name is Edward, and so we'll learn about them in future weeks, but he is Ned. Everyone knew him as Ned. And Ned was born into slavery in 1840 on Christmas Day. He lived on a plantation with his parents and with his siblings, which is really a rare thing. His slave owner's will had him listed or valued at $1,200, which is a lot of money for a slave back then, which suggested that he was strong and mighty and a virile slave, and contributed a lot to the plantation. So while he lived and grew up on the plantation, he did not tell very many people in his old age stories about living there. He didn't like to give strength or memory to the abuses he faced. Sorry. But one story he told his granddaughter was that if he leaned on his knees with his elbows when he was picking cotton, his master would come and beat him and torture him. And when he saw how those stories affected his children and his grandchildren, he felt silenced and he stopped sharing them. In 1860, when he was about 20 years old, he married his first wife, Florida, because he was a slave and she was also a slave. They weren't able to be legally married, but they were married in their own ceremony and committed to one another. And they had their first son, Henry, 4 years later. And we're going to learn about Henry probably in 1 or 2 weeks, depending on how it all plays out. And so he's got an incredible story as well. And then 4 years later, Florida had a second baby, and unfortunately, really unfortunately, she passed away during childbirth, and her baby also passed away. And so then Ned was a single father taking care of his son while experiencing slavery. And a few years later, he met Susan Gray Reed, who was also widowed herself, and she also had 2 young sons. And so they kind of joined together and fell in love, and at this point they were able to be legally married. Some of the family stories say that they had to run away and flee slavery. Others said that they were freed because we know slavery was abolished in 1865. So others say that he didn't have to run away. Not totally sure on that, but they were able to get married, and his sister Amanda and her husband Daniel Davidson Chambers had been converted to the gospel. They lived in Mississippi. I don't think I mentioned that. So this is in Mississippi. And his sister Amanda taught him the gospel and encouraged them to head to Utah with the saints. They didn't join the church in Mississippi, but they did decide to go with Amanda and her husband. Her husband Daniel, he was actually introduced to the church as a slave and was baptized, but he was unable to make the journey west until he was emancipated, and then he had to spend a ton of time saving up money to be able to come here. So finally all of them were able to come. So their 3 little boys from their separate marriages came with the sister and with Daniel, and they made it their way across the plains. I also didn't mention that this is called Korean beef, but there's no way it's authentic. It's just delicious and really easy. Week after week showing you some non-authentic food, I guess, is my thing now. Anyway, so they made it in the Salt Lake Valley. They moved into the Salt Lake First Ward, and they lived there for a while. 3 years later, after they moved there, Susan and Ned were baptized, and their other children were baptized. And then a bunch of black members of the church were buying land in Mill Creek, and we've talked about some of their stories in weeks past, so you can go back and check those out, of other black members who bought land in Mill Creek. So they also bought land in Mill Creek, and they lived there for a little while. They had their first daughter there and raised a few of their children there. And they moved into a ward that the 8th ward was in, which is where there were more black members. I think they felt more united. They came from the South, where it was just the culture was completely different, and he did talk about that to his children and grandchildren, that it took a while to get used to a different culture here in Utah. So about 5 years after they were baptized, September 3rd, 1875, they were able to go to the endowment house with other black members that we've talked about also in past videos. And there they were able to do proxy work, and they were rebaptized, so they're on their second baptism as well. But they did proxy work, and what's really sweet is that Ned was able to do the temple work for his wife Susan's late husband, which I just think is so incredible. And unfortunately, from what I understand, is he was unable to do Florida's work since they were unable to be legally married. And so I am grateful to know that while that's not fair, that it will be made up. And I know, and I have confidence, that their reunion was probably so sweet in the next life. After spending some time in Mill Creek, they decided that they wanted to help further the work in Idaho. So Susan and Ned moved to Milo, Idaho. I should know what that's called. I don't. I'm not from Idaho. So they moved to Idaho, and my rice is cooking for this meal, so that's what our beeping is. I'm sorry. So they moved to Idaho, and they started establishing farmland there. He bought a successful ranch, and they were able to build all of the farmland up there. If you go there, you can still see rows of huge established trees that he planted and grew there. He lived there for many years, and then in 1911 they sold their ranch and they retired in Idaho Falls, which is like 12 miles from where their ranch was. So it wasn't like this huge journey to Idaho Falls, and that's where he lived out the rest of his life. His family, and we're going to talk about the Leggroan family quite a bit, kind of like we've been talking about the Abel family. I kind of try to tell these stories somewhat in kind of a chronological order, which is why we bounce around families a little bit, so I apologize for that. But his family say that he is the kindest man they ever knew, and that through generations his kindness passed on to his sons and his sons' sons, because he was just such a strong patriarch and passed that along. And they said his experiences with slavery were terrible, and he worked hard to suppress those feelings. When he passed away, a couple newspapers covered not only his obituary, but shared stories about him and the hard work that he put into his land. And here are some of the things that they said. Ned's Time Registrar obituary reported that he lived to see the U.S. engage in 3 major wars. He was born and reared in bondage. He lived to become not only a highly respected citizen, but a voter and a landowner as well. It took character, industry, and brains to accomplish what Ned Leggroan has accomplished during his life. The Salt Lake Tribune told its readers, "He will be buried by his white friends of the LDS Church and by the entire colony of colored people residing in this vicinity of southeast Idaho." His funeral was conducted in an Idaho Falls LDS meeting house on the 2nd of February, 1926, after which his body was taken to Milo, Idaho, to be buried in a beautiful and peaceful little cemetery there. Thanks to the hard work of early farmers and homesteaders like the Leggroans, Milo is now filled with tree-lined, green, productive farmland. Ned rests next to Susan, his wife of 56 years, and their son, David. I am grateful for Ned and his example and his willingness to remain faithful and to give so much of himself. His tenacity and his willingness to work hard and his ability to rear such a beautiful and righteous family stands out to me. Thank you for listening to Ned's story today, and thank you for coming to Mix It Up Black History and the Restoration. I'm Taylor Ricks, and I will see you next week. Goodbye.